Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The rain hammered the glass, each drop a tiny fist, trying to break into the quiet world she had built. Inside, the only sounds were the ones she allowed. The gentle tick-tock of a dozen clocks, a symphony of measured time, the soft rasp of a polishing cloth against brass, the shallow, even whisper of her own breath. Control, that was the word she lived by. Mayra Linwin smelled of metal and mineral oil, of the harsh lavender soap she used to scrub her skin raw each morning and night. She lived in a cocoon of human scents, a fortress built to starve the creature that slept inside her. Some shifters wore perfumes, layered themselves in chemicals to hide. Mayra simply erased herself. She was a ghost, a blank page. No scent, no pack, no past. The city helped. Its cacophony of exhaust fumes, stale food, and damp concrete was a constant, welcome assault on senses she kept deliberately dull. Tonight, the moon was full. She could feel it. A dull ache behind her eyes, a restless thrum in her. Blood. A pull. The wolf stirred in its shallow grave, and she pushed it back down with the practiced ease of long suffering. She focused on the watch in her hands. Its heart was a constellation of gears and springs. A perfect, tiny machine. Predictable. Fixable. Everything her own nature was not. The wind howled, a lonely lupine sound that made the hairs on her arms prickle. She ignored it. She wound the mainspring, her touch delicate, her focus absolute. Then, the bell, a sharp, discordant jangle that shattered the peace. It was bolted to the front door of her little shop, a warning for the rare customer who wandered in. But not now, not this late. The closed sign had been turned for hours. The storm was a wall of noise and water. No one should be out. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tiny screwdriver in her hand felt suddenly useless, a child's toy. The ticking of the clocks grew louder, faster, counting down to something she didn't want to meet. Silence. Maybe it was just the wind, a loose shudder, her own frayed nerves. She let out a slow, careful breath, turning back to the watch on her workbench. The door creaked open. A gust of cold, wet air swept through the shop, carrying the smell of the storm. Rain, wet earth, and something else. Something wild and dark. Ozone, pine, and blood. So much blood. The scent hit her like a physical blow, raw and metallic, a coppery scream in the quiet air. Her pulse stumbled. The air refused to move. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a giant of a man, his frame filling the entrance. He swayed for a moment. One hand braced against the wood, his head bowed. Rain dripped from his dark hair, pooling at his feet. He took one step inside, then another. His boots left wet, dark prints on her floorboards. He was hurt, badly. The human part of her, the soft part she'd cultivated like a rare flower, felt a tremor of pity. The other part, the old and terrified part, screamed one word. Run! He lifted. His head, and even in the dim light from her work lamp, she could see the exhaustion etched onto his harsh features. A strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth set in a grim line, a jagged scar cut through one eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline. He was a creature carved from granite and fury. But his eyes, they were searching, desperate. Please, he rasped, the word a gravelly ruin. Then his legs gave out. He fell, not with a simple collapse, but like a great tree coming down. The floorboards groaned under his weight. The sound echoed in the sudden, ringing silence, louder than the storm. He lay sprawled on the floor of her shop. Still. Too still. Mayra didn't breathe. For a full minute, the only sound was the rain and the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. She should leave, lock the door behind her and melt back into the city's shadows. This was not her problem. This was the kind of trouble that got people like her killed. A shifter, bleeding and cornered, was a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. But she couldn't move. His scent was overwhelming her, carefully constructed defenses. It wasn't just wolf. It was something more. Ancient. Dominant. A scent that spoke of mountains and old forests, of lightning and sovereign command. It was the scent of an alpha. Not just any alpha. This was power. Raw and terrifying. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, she pushed her stool back and stood. Her legs trembled. She crept toward him, her bare feet silent on the wood. He was lying on his side, his face turned away from her. A thick, dark coat was soaked through, clinging to his broad shoulders. The smell of blood was stronger now, a hot, cloying cloud. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering, useless. Can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice thin. No response. His breathing was shallow, a ragged hitch in his chest. She had to see the wound. With trembling fingers, she reached out, gently pushing aside the heavy fabric of his coat. Her fingertips brushed against cold, wet leather, and then skin. It was hot, feverish. Her touch seemed to jolt him. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound like shifting stone. It wasn't directed at her. It was the sound of a great beast fighting its own pain. She found the wound on his side, a deep, wicked gash, torn through his shirt and into the flesh beneath. It was bleeding sluggishly, the blood a terrifyingly dark shade of crimson. It looked like a claw mark, a big one. Without thinking, she pressed her hand against it, trying to staunch the flow. A foolish, human gesture. The moment her palm made contact with his blood, the world fractured. A shockwave went through her, a bolt of pure lightning that shot up her arm and slammed into her heart. Her breath was stolen from her lungs in a sharp gasp. The tiny, caged thing inside her didn't stir. It exploded. For years, her wolf had been a whisper, a phantom limb. Now, it rose up and screamed, a tide of pure, unadulterated instinct. It was a feral, hungry thing, clawing its way out of the grave she had dug for it. The scents in the room detonated. She could suddenly smell the rain-soaked wool of his coat, the worn leather of his boots, the iron tang of his blood, and beneath it all, his true scent, the scent of a king, pine and winter frost and raw, untamed power. He smelled of absolute authority. Her own scent, the one she kept buried under a mountain of soap and denial, broke free. It uncoiled like a living thing, the delicate, telltale fragrance of an omega, sweetgrass and night-blooming jasmine, and a vulnerability that was a death sentence in the wrong company. The man on the floor jerked, his whole body going rigid. The growl in his chest deepened, changing. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was recognition. His eyes snapped open. They weren't brown or blue or gray. They were the color of molten gold, burning with an impossible light, the pupils blown wide. They locked on her. He didn't see a human girl in a worn-out sweater. He saw her. He saw what she was. His gaze was a physical weight, pinning her to the floor. He inhaled sharply, a ragged, desperate breath, and his gaze flickered down to her hand, still pressed against his side. Her hand, now slick and coated in his blood. Her wolf howled in her mind, a sound of terror and triumph. It knew him. It knew his blood. It bowed its head in submission, an instinct so deep, so primal, she felt her own spine curve. "You," he breathed, the word a blade of sound. His hand shot out, impossibly fast for a wounded man. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't push her away. His fingers, strong and calloused, wrapped around her wrist. His touch was an inferno, searing her skin. His blood on her hand, his hand on her skin. A circuit was completed. Power, raw and ancient, poured out of him and into her. It wasn't a gentle connection. It was a violent claiming. The dormant parts of her, the heightened senses, the strength, the deep well of shifter life roared into existence. The ticking clock sounded like hammers. The single bare bulb overhead burned like a sun. She was drowning in him, in his pain, his rage, his sheer, suffocating presence. She tried to pull back, a strangled cry catching in her throat, but his grip was iron. He was bleeding out on her floor, yet he held her with the strength of a god. His golden eyes held hers, a storm of disbelief and something else swirling in their depths, something that looked terrifyingly like destiny. Her carefully built world of silence and control was gone, burned to ashes in a single heartbeat. The ghost was gone. In her place was a terrified Omega, scent-marked and claimed by the blood of a dying Alpha King. He stared at the blood on her skin, then back at her face, a dawning horror mixing with the pain. The blood on her hand began to feel hot, not from his body heat, but with a magic of its own. It tingled, then burned, a fire sinking through her skin, into her very bones. His blood wasn't just a stain, it was a brand. The burn deepened, a root of fire, planting itself in the palm of her hand, tendrils of heat snaking up her veins. His blood was alive. It was writing a story on her skin, a story she never wanted to read. His golden eyes held her, pupils like black holes in burning suns. He was seeing into her, past the plain clothes and the human scent, down to the trembling, pathetic thing she had kept chained in the dark for a decade. "What?" he choked out, his voice a low growl of disbelief. "What are you?" The question was a thunderclap in the small shop. Mayra's own voice was a stone in her throat. Words had been her first sacrifice to this life of hiding. She rarely used them, and now they wouldn't come. Her wolf, newly resurrected, was screaming in her skull. It screamed submission. It screamed terror. It screamed a horrifying, possessive word. Mine. He tried to push himself up, his muscles cording with a strength that defied the gash in his side. The movement was a mistake. A fresh wave of blood, dark and thick, welled from the wound, spilling over her hand. A strangled groan was torn from his chest, and his eyes lost focus, the golden light dimming. He was dying. The thought was clinical, cold, and it was followed by a wave of panic so profound it buckled her knees. It wasn't just pity. It was instinct. Primal. An animal terror at the thought of the dominant predator in the room. Ceasing. The alpha must not fall. The pack must not be broken. What pack? She had no pack. She was nothing. A ghost. But the blood on her skin disagreed. It tethered her to him. A chain forged in agony and power. He collapsed back, his grip on her wrist going slack for just a second. It was her chance. Her one chance to run, to rip her hand away, flee into the storm, and never look back. Let the city swallow her again. Let someone else find the body. She didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet were lead. Her bones felt rooted to the floor. Leaving him felt like tearing out her own heart, an insane, impossible feeling. He was a stranger, a monster, a threat to her very existence. And her wolf was whining, a low, mournful sound in the back of her mind, begging her not to leave him. "Damn it," she whispered, the word a rusty flake of sound. The city was a death sentence. Staying was a worse one. But his blood was on her, in her. The choice had already been made. With a surge of desperate strength, she shifted her weight. "Get up," she grunted, her voice raw with disuse. "You have to get up." He blinked, his focus swimming back for a moment. He looked at her, then at the door, then back to her. A flicker of understanding. He was exposed here, a target. He nodded, a barely perceptible motion. Getting him to his feet was like trying to raise a fallen oak. He was a mountain of muscle and bone. She hooked her shoulder under his arm, her small frame straining. The scent of him was dizzying pine, storm, and the hot iron of his blood. It soaked into her clothes, into her hair, erasing her, remaking her. He leaned on her, his weight a crushing burden. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. He staggered, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. "Where?" "Upstairs," she managed, her teeth gritted. The stairs behind the counter were narrow, steep, and dark. A death trap. They took them one at a time, a slow, agonizing eternity. He grunted with each step, a fresh wave of pain radiating from him. She could feel it, not just sense it, but feel it a phantom ache in her own side, a thrumming echo of his agony. The bond was a two-way street, a parasite. Her apartment was as sparse as her life. A bed, a small table, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. It was a cell, but it was her cell, safe, silent, until now. He collapsed onto her narrow bed, the frame groaning in protest. He filled the entire space, a dark, wounded king, on a pauper's throne, his head lolled to the side, his eyes closed. For a terrifying second, she thought his heart had stopped, but then she heard it. The faint, fluttering beat, the ragged pull of air into his lungs. The rain beat against the window pane, a frantic, relentless rhythm. The city outside didn't know. It didn't care. It kept its secrets, and she had to keep hers. This one was just bigger, bloodier, and more dangerous than any she had ever imagined. She lit an old oil lamp, the flame chasing the worst of the shadows into the corners. In the flickering golden light, he looked even more formidable. His face was pale beneath his tanned skin, but his features were harsh, unforgiving. This was not a man who knew softness. This was a man who broke things. Pacts, treaties, bones. She had to see the wound properly. Her hands shook as she reached for the hem of his shirt. It was fine wool, soaked and ruined. She tore the fabric, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The gash was worse than she'd thought. Deep, jagged. The edges were dark, almost black, and the skin around it was unnaturally cold. It wasn't just a simple claw mark. There was something else at play here. Something that felt like poison. She needed water, cloth, thread. She moved on autopilot, gathering the meager supplies from her small washroom. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear. Who did this? Who could wound a creature of this power and let him get away? And who would be coming to finish the job? They would be hunting him. And now, they would be hunting her too. They would smell his blood on this place. On her. She returned to his side with a bowl of warm water and a strip of clean linen. She hesitated, her hand hovering over his skin. Touching him again felt like putting her hand back into a fire. She had no choice. She began to clean the wound, her touch as gentle as she could manage. He flinched, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but he didn't wake. His skin was fever-hot, except for the chilling cold around the injury. As she worked, her fingers brushed against something hard tucked into the waistband of his trousers. A wallet? A weapon? Curiosity warred with fear. She needed to know who he was, not just what he was. She slid her fingers carefully, pulling the object free. It wasn't a wallet. It was a leather sheath, small and worn. Inside was not a knife, but a single, heavy piece of metal. A medallion. She turned it over in the lamplight. The blood drained from her face. It was a wolf's head, rendered in stark, severe lines. A crown of iron thorns pressed into its brow. The sigil of the Valais clan, the royal pack, the rulers of the northern territories, and by right of conquest and blood, the undisputed sovereigns of every shifter on the continent. Her breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't just an alpha. This wasn't just a royal. This was him, King Corin Valais, the Blood Wolf, the unmated king who had torn through 3 rival packs to secure his crown before his 30th winter. A man whose name was a whispered curse, a bogeyman used to frighten shifter children, and he was bleeding out on her bed. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the edge of the bed to steady herself. The stories said he was a savage, that he had no heart, that he ruled through fear alone. They said he had sworn an oath to the moon to never take a mate, to never share his power, for his bloodline was cursed. His blood, which was currently staining her hands, her floor, her life. He stirred, muttering something in his fevered sleep. A single word, a name. Not hers. It sounded like a piece of glass breaking. She had to finish. She took a needle and thread, the same fine, strong thread she used for watch straps, and began to stitch the wound closed. It was a clumsy, brutal process. Her hands weren't made for this. They were made for tiny gears and delicate springs. Each stitch felt like a violation. Each pull of the thread seemed to bind her closer to him, sewing her into his fate. When she was done, she wrapped his torso in clean bandages. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. She sank back on her heels, exhausted. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow, trembling emptiness in its wake. The room was silent, save for his breathing, which was already a little deeper, a little more even. Shifter healing was a miracle, but even miracles needed a head start. She watched him, this terrifying myth made of flesh and blood, the king of their kind, laid low, vulnerable. His power was a tangible thing in the room, a pressure against her skin, even in his unconsciousness. It hummed, a low, dangerous frequency that vibrated in her bones. He had asked her what she was, an omega, the lowest of the low, scented to inspire calm, born to nurture. In the old packs, they were revered. In the new world, they were liabilities, bargaining chips, targets. Their very nature was a weakness, an invitation for violence from those who would use or break them. That's why she hid. That's why she had no scent. An omega without a scent was a story that didn't make sense, a creature that shouldn't exist, a ghost. His eyes opened. The gold was back, but it was clearer now, sharper. The fever had receded, replaced by a cold, hard assessment. He looked at the fresh bandages, then at the needle and thread on the table. Then, his gaze landed on her. He didn't speak for a long time. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. "You didn't run," he said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, layered with something she couldn't decipher. Surprise? Suspicion? She shook her head, unable to find her voice. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, the movement slow but deliberate. His eyes never left her face. "They will smell my blood on you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "The ones who did this to me. Others. My scent is a beacon, and you are standing in its heart." She flinched. She knew. Of course she knew. "There is nowhere in this city you can hide now," he continued, his voice dropping lower, each word a stone laid on her grave. "Nowhere on this continent." He held her gaze, a king passing sentence. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken laws and inevitable consequences. The mark on her hand, where his blood had branded her, began to ache with a dull, insistent heat. He saw her glance at it, and a strange, dark look passed over his face. "That blood is not a stain," he said, his voice a raw whisper that cut through the sound of the rain. "It is an oath. You answered it, whether you wanted to or not." He shifted, his gaze sweeping over her small, bare room, over the ghost of a life she had tried to build. He looked back at her, the kneeling, nameless Omega who had saved him. "You belong to the crown now, little ghost." His words hung in the air, heavy and cold as iron. "You belong to the crown. Now." Not a threat, not a promise. A simple, brutal statement of fact, like saying the moon commands the tides, or winter brings the snow. Maera felt the declaration settle in her bones, a weight she was never meant to carry. She had spent her life belonging to nothing, to no one. It was the entire architecture of her survival. Now, a king had claimed her as a territory. Her first instinct was to deny it, to find her voice and scream that she belonged only to herself. But the words died before they were born. The look in his golden eyes wasn't cruel or possessive. It was worse. It was certain, as if he was reading a truth written in a language only he could understand. The mark on her palm throbbed in agreement. A dull, hot pulse that beat in time with his heart, not her own. He watched her, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the flicker of defiance in her eyes, and the sheer terror that extinguished it. He saw the way she hugged her arms to herself, a frail barrier against a world that had just been torn open. A flicker of something pity? Regret? Crossed his face before it was replaced by that harsh, granite mask of command. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice was softer now, but it held the same core of unyielding steel. She swallowed. The sound was loud in the silence. "Maera. Maera," he repeated, testing the sound of it. The single word, spoken in his low rasp, felt like a judgment and a caress all at once. It made her skin prickle. "You have no pack mark, no scent of allegiance. You smell of nothing. How?" The question she had dreaded her entire adult life. How do you erase yourself? How do you become a ghost? She looked down at her hands, at the faint silver scars that patterned her wrists, hidden most days by the long sleeves she always wore. Scars from herbs that burned, from rituals that silenced, from a desperate, agonizing process of unbecoming. "I'm careful," she whispered. It was a pathetic answer, a child's lie. The king's eyes narrowed. He knew it was a lie, but he didn't push. Not yet. Instead, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, planting his bare feet on her floor. He moved stiffly, pain etched in the tight line of his mouth, but he stood. He was immense. The low ceiling of her small room seemed to shrink around him. He was a creature of mountains and open sky, trapped in a shoebox. "The ones who attacked me were not shifters," he said, his voice a low rumble. He walked to her small window, peering through the rain-streaked glass at the brick wall beyond. They were hired blades, human, but they used silver. He touched the bandages on his side, tipped in it, laced with wolfsbane. Maera's blood went cold. Silver and wolfsbane. A poison cocktail designed not just to wound, but to maim, to cripple a shifter's healing, to burn them from the inside out. It was a miracle he was still standing, a testament to the sheer, monstrous power that flowed in his veins. "They will have a tracker," he continued, his back still to her. "Someone who can follow my scent, even in this storm. We don't have long." The word was a hook in her gut. He had dragged her into his world, a world of assassins and poison and crowns. "I have to go," she said, the words rushing out in a panicked breath. I can't be here. I can't. He turned slowly. His golden eyes pinned her in place. You think leaving this room will save you? He asked, a bitter, humorless smile touching his lips. Myra, look at your hand. She looked. Against the pale skin of her palm, where his blood had spilled, a mark was forming. It wasn't a stain anymore. It was a delicate, intricate tracery of lines, like black ink bleeding into paper just beneath the surface of her skin. It was faint, a ghost of an image. But it was there, a wolf's head, crowned in thorns, his sigil, branded into her flesh by his blood. Her breath hitched. A brand of allegiance. A claim. In the old laws, it was a mark given to the most trusted members of a royal's guard, to those bound by blood and magic to serve, or to a mate. The thought sent a jolt of pure chemical terror through her. No, he was the unmated king. He had sworn an oath. Everyone knew it. What is this? She breathed, her voice trembling. It is a complication, he said, his voice flat. He looked at the mark on her hand, and the look on his face was one of grim, weary frustration. My blood carries the weight of my line, of the crown. It should not have reacted to you. It has never reacted to anyone. He took a step closer. The air crackled. Her wolf, which had been a quiet, trembling thing since its reawakening, stirred again. It was not afraid of him. It was drawn to him, a moth to a catastrophic flame. It recognized him as its alpha, its king, its something more, a word that had no place in her mind. Mate. She flinched back, stumbling a step. Stay away from me. His eyes flashed with a dangerous light. That will be difficult, he growled, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. When your scent is calling to every part of me. Her scent? She had no scent, but she did. She could smell it herself now, faintly. The sweet grass and jasmine, uncoiling in the air, no longer masked by her frantic control. It was weak, but it was there, and to his heightened senses, it must be a siren song. An Omega's scent, a beacon of submission and compatibility, calling to the Alpha King. He stopped, holding himself in check with an effort that made the muscles in his jaw bunch. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the raw instinct was banked, replaced by cold control. They are coming, he said, his voice clipped. We leave. Now. Leave? To where? Her world was these four walls. This city block. The quiet, gray life she had built. Outside of that was only danger. To my territory. To the north. The north. A land of ice and stone and feral packs who still followed the old ways. A place where a scentless, packless Omega would be torn apart. No, she said. The word small but firm. I won't. He took the final step that separated them. He didn't touch her. He didn't have to. His sheer presence was a physical force, pressing in on her, stealing her air. He loomed over her, a dark shadow. You stitched my wound, he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. You cleaned it with your own hands. You bound yourself to me with thread and mercy, and my blood branded you in return. You think the old magic gives you a choice? He was wrong. It wasn't mercy. It was a stupid, suicidal instinct she couldn't control. I will not be your prisoner, she hissed, finding a spark of anger in the depths of her fear. His expression hardened. It is better than being a corpse. He glanced toward the window. They will not be gentle when they find you. They will want to know how I survived, who helped me. They will peel you apart, piece by piece, to get those answers. His words painted a picture so vivid, so brutal, that a tremor of pure horror went through her. He was right. She knew he was right. Her quiet life was over. The ghost was dead. All that was left was Mayra, the girl with the king's blood on her hands. He saw the surrender in her eyes. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. Get your coat. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a thin wool coat, but she retrieved it, her movements stiff and robotic. Her mind was numb. This wasn't happening. It was a nightmare. Soon she would wake up to the sound of ticking clocks and the smell of oil and metal. He was already at the door, listening, not with his ears, but with his entire body. He stood perfectly still, a predator sensing the changing winds. The power rolling off him was immense, a tightly coiled spring of violence waiting to be released. They're here, he breathed, 2 floors down, moving up. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked around her tiny apartment, at the life she was about to lose. It wasn't much, but it had been hers. It had been safe. Corin turned to her. In the dim lamplight, the scar over his eye looked like a livid brand. His face was grim. "There is one way out," he said, his gaze flicking to the window. "It won't be pleasant." She followed his gaze. The window. And beyond it, a sheer drop of 3 stories to a narrow, trash-filled alleyway. It was suicide. "You're insane," she whispered. "I'm alive," he countered, "and I intend to stay that way." He moved to the window and unlatched it, pushing it open. The wind and rain lashed into the room, sending papers flying. The sounds of the city rushed in a distant siren. The rumble of a truck, the angry hiss of the storm. He looked at her. "You will do exactly as I say. Do you understand?" She nodded. Mute. "I will go. First, I will be below you. If you fall, I will catch you." The thought of falling was terrifying. The thought of him catching her was somehow worse. To be in his arms, to feel that power up close. Footsteps pounded on the stairs outside her apartment door. Heavy, ominous. They were coming. There was no more time. Corin swung one leg over the sill, then the other. He clung to the window frame, his powerful body braced against the slick brick. The rain soaked him instantly, plastering his dark hair to his skull. He looked back at her, his golden eyes blazing in the dark. Now, Mayra. Her name was a command, a lifeline. The door to her apartment splintered. A heavy boot kicked it once, then twice. The wood groaned, about to give way. Mayra didn't think. She scrambled to the window, her heart in her throat. She climbed out, her fingers clumsy on the wet sill. The wind tried to tear her from the wall. The alley below seemed a mile away. The door crashed open behind her. She didn't look back. She let go, her stomach lurching, and dropped into the darkness. For a terrifying, weightless second, she was falling. Then strong arms circled her waist, breaking her fall. She slammed into a body as hard as stone, Corin. He absorbed the impact with a low grunt, his arms a cage of steel around her. He held her tight against his chest for a heartbeat, her face pressed into his rain-soaked shirt. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart against her cheek. He smelled of the storm. He set her on her feet but kept a firm grip on her arm, pulling her into the deeper shadows of the alley. 2 figures, large and cloaked, appeared in the shattered frame of her window above. They hadn't seen them, not yet. Corin pulled her down the alley, his steps silent and swift, despite his injury. He moved like a shadow, a creature born of the night. She had to half-run to keep up, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. They emerged onto a deserted street, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. The rain was finally easing, but the air was cold, heavy with menace. She was free of her room, but she had never felt more trapped in her life. He led her to a dark, brutal-looking vehicle parked half a block away, a machine built for war, not for city streets. He opened the passenger door. "Get in." She hesitated, her hand on the cold metal. Getting into that car felt like the final, irrevocable step. It was crossing a line, the end of Mayra the ghost, and the beginning of something else, something terrifying. Corin's patience snapped. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "Now." She scrambled inside. The interior smelled of leather and him. He slammed the door, walked around, and got in the driver's side. The engine roared to life with a sound like a waking beast. He didn't turn on the headlights. He pulled away from the curb, a black shadow gliding through the rain-slicked streets. Mayra looked back, just once. She saw the 2 figures drop from her window into the alley. They were already searching. It was too late. She was gone. The mark on her hand burned, a silent, searing promise. She belonged to the crown now, and the king was taking her home. Silence was a weapon. Corin Valleas wielded it with the precision of a master torturer. He drove through the sleeping city, his large hands sure on the wheel, his golden eyes scanning the rain-slicked streets, the dark alleyways, the reflections in the storefront glass. He was hunting for hunters. The air in the vehicle was thick with his concentration, a palpable pressure that made it hard for Mayra to breathe. She sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her thin coat a pathetic shield against the chilling reality of her situation. Her apartment, her tiny world, was miles behind them, a crime scene she could never return to. Ahead lay the north, a word that tasted of ice and blood. The city lights blurred past the window. painting, fleeting streaks of neon and white across the king's harsh profile. He was a creature of stark angles and severe lines, a living carving of sovereign will. His power was a low hum that vibrated through the leather seats, through the very floor of the truck. It seeped into her, a constant, invasive presence. Her own long-dormant senses were screaming, overwhelmed by the sheer proximity of an alpha of his magnitude. Every nerve ending felt raw, exposed. She chanced a glance at her palm. The mark was darker now. A vivid, lace-like shadow of his sigil burned into her skin. It was a brand, a map, a claim. It pulsed with a faint warmth, a constant reminder of the blood that had sealed her fate. His blood. "They will find your shop," he said, his voice startling her out of her stupor. It was a low, gravelly sound, devoid of inflection. "They will find your scent, what little there is of it." "There's nothing to find," she whispered, her voice tight. "No family, no records. I never existed." He glanced at her, a quick, sharp look. "Everyone exists somewhere," he stated. "Everyone comes from a pack, not me." The denial was automatic. The lie she had told herself so many times it felt like the truth. He didn't argue. He simply turned his attention back to the road. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. It was heavier, laced with his unspoken questions. He was a king. Kings did not tolerate mysteries in their territory, and she was, by his own declaration, his territory now. He drove them out of the city's heart, toward the industrial outskirts where the streetlights grew sparse and the buildings devolved into skeletal warehouses and rusted chain-link fences. He pulled the vehicle into a cavernous, abandoned loading dock, the darkness inside absolute. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. It was broken only by the sound of rain dripping from a hole in the corrugated metal roof and the ragged whisper of her own breathing. "Why are we stopping?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "They are following," he said, his voice a low growl. "A single car. No headlights. They've been behind us since we left your street." Mayra's blood ran cold. She strained to look through the rear window, but saw only impenetrable blackness. Her human eyes were useless. But he could see, he could hear, he could smell. He was the predator, and he had led the other wolves into his trap. "Stay in the truck," he commanded. The words were not a request. He opened his door and slipped out into the darkness, silent as a wraith. The door clicked shut, plunging her into an even deeper isolation. She was alone, trapped in a metal box, listening, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Her reawakened senses, clumsy and untrained, were a torment. She could hear the scuttling of a rat somewhere in the vast warehouse. She could smell the damp concrete, the old oil, and the faint, coppery tang of his blood still lingering in the air. And then she heard another sound. The crunch of tires on gravel, slow and cautious. A car door opening. Then another. The soft, deliberate footsteps of men who were trying to be silent. Her breath hitched. They were here. She pressed herself back against the seat, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Muffled voices cut through the rain. Human voices. Angry, frustrated. He was here. "The scent is strong. Find him. The client wants him dead before dawn. And find the girl." She helped him. "She has to be here." The girl. Me. The words were a physical blow. They knew about her. They were looking for her. The fragile hope that this was all a mistake, a terrible case of wrong place, wrong time, shattered into a million pieces. Then, the sounds of violence began. It was not a prolonged battle. It was a swift, brutal execution. A choked cry. The sickening, wet crunch of bone breaking. A heavy thud as a body hit the concrete floor. Silence. Then, another set of footsteps, running this time. A desperate, panicked flight. It was cut short by a sound that tore through the night. A sound that bypassed her ears and went straight to the primal core of her being. A growl, not the low, rumbling warning from the king. This was the full, unrestrained sound of the alpha. It was a promise of death, a tearing, vicious snarl that spoke of ripped flesh and shattered spines. It was the sound of the beast unleashed. Mayra squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying to her ears, but she couldn't block it out. She could feel it in her bones, a sympathetic vibration that made her own wolf cower and whine in the back of her mind. A single, piercing scream. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise it replaced. The driver's side door opened. Corin slid back into the seat. He was untouched, not a scratch on him, but the air around him was different. It was charged, electric, with the aftermath of violence. The scent of his rage, sharp and ozonic like a lightning strike, filled the small cabin. He said nothing. He simply started the engine and pulled out of the warehouse, leaving the darkness and the bodies behind. They drove for another hour, leaving the city's dying glow behind them, plunging into the deep, unending darkness of the countryside. The road became a narrow ribbon of asphalt winding through dense forest. The trees crowded in on either side, their branches like skeletal arms reaching for the truck. He finally pulled over onto a gravel shoulder overlooking a moonlit valley. He cut the engine, and this time, the silence was different. It was the quiet of the wild, the chirping of crickets, the sigh of the wind in the pines. "They will send more," he said, his voice flat. He was no longer looking at the road, but at her. His golden eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, intense and searching. "Who are they?" she asked, finding a sliver of courage. "Who wants you dead?" A muscle in his jaw clenched. "A rival. A man who believes my crown should be his. A fool. And he hired humans to do his dirty work? It is cleaner that way," Corin said, a bitter edge to his voice. "It avoids a pack war. Officially." He paused, his gaze dropping to her hands, still clenched in her lap. "He will not stop. And now that he knows you exist, he will see you as a weakness, a tool to be used against me." The words landed like stones. Weakness, tool. That's all she was. All an Omega ever was to men like him. "I am not your weakness," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "I am nothing to you." "You are wrong," he growled, and in a movement too fast to track, he reached across the console and took her hand. Not her wrist this time. He laced his fingers through hers, his large, calloused hand engulfing her own. His touch was an electric shock, sending a jolt straight to her heart. He turned her hand over, his thumb stroking the brand on her palm. "This says you are mine," he whispered, his voice a raw, possessive rumble that vibrated through her bones. "My blood has claimed you. The old magic has bound you. Do you think that means nothing?" She tried to pull her hand away, but his grip was gentle and absolute. She was trapped. "I don't believe in the old magic." "It believes in you," he countered, his gaze burning into hers. "Your wolf believes. I can feel it. It is awake now, and it recognizes its alpha." She couldn't deny it. The creature inside her was a turmoil of conflicting instincts. It was terrified of his power, yet it yearned to submit to it. It wanted to run, and it wanted to press closer. It was a part of her she didn't know, a stranger living under her skin. "Let me go," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Please, just let me disappear again. I'm good at it. No one will ever find me." A look of profound, ancient weariness crossed his face. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't a king. He was just a man, scarred and burdened. "It is too late for that, Myra," he said, his voice laced with a deep, aching regret. "From the moment my blood touched your skin, you became part of this. Part of my world. My war." He released her hand, but the heat of his touch lingered, a phantom brand on top of the real one. He looked out at the dark valley, at the sliver of moon hanging in the sky. "The north is 2 days' drive. In my lands, you will be protected. You will be safe." Safe. The word sounded like a lie. How could she be safe with him? He was the epicenter of the danger, the storm she was caught in. "And what happens then?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "When we get to your home, what am I to you?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind howled softly outside, a lonely, mournful sound. "In the north," he said finally, his voice low and heavy with a weight she couldn't comprehend. "You will be what the moon decreed the moment you chose not to run." He turned his head, his golden eyes meeting hers in the darkness of the truck. The rage was gone. The cold command was gone. All that was left was a raw, aching intensity that stripped her bare. "You will be my mate." The words were a stone thrown into the deep, still water of her soul. "You will be my mate." Ripples of shock and disbelief spread through her, cold and sharp. Her mind rejected the statement, recoiled from it like a physical blow. It was impossible. A lie. A cruel, insane joke. He was the unmated king, the alpha who had sworn an oath to the moon, to his ancestors, to his own cursed bloodline, that he would never take a mate. It was the foundation of his legend, the core of his terrifying solitude. "No," she breathed, the word a ragged puff of air. "You're lying. Everyone knows. You swore an oath." His face, cast in the pale moonlight filtering through the windshield, was a mask of granite. There was no deception in his eyes, only a grim, terrible certainty. "I did," he confirmed, his voice a low rumble of crushed stone. "An oath I intended to keep until the day I died." "Then what is this?" she cried, her voice cracking. She held up her hand, the mark on her palm a dark accusation in the gloom. "What am I to you? A broken promise? A convenient excuse?" A flicker of something dark and painful moved in the depths of his golden eyes. "You are the exception I never planned for," he said, his voice raw. "The one variable the fates saw fit to throw at my feet. The oath was made to protect my line, to protect my people from a taint in my blood. A taint, a curse. The whispers she'd heard in the city, the fragments of shifter gossip she'd tried so hard to ignore, suddenly clicked into place. They said the Valeus line was strong, but unstable, that their rage was a fire that could not be controlled, that it consumed their mates, their children, their own souls. The brand on your hand. It is not just a claim," he continued, his gaze fixed on the mark as if it were a venomous snake. "It is a sign. The old magic recognized something in you, something that answered the call of my blood. It chose you. I don't want to be chosen," she shot back, her fear finally igniting into a spark of pure, desperate anger. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you to bleed all over my life and ruin it." The truth of her words, the sheer raw agony of them, hung in the air between them. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply absorbed her fury, his expression unchanging. He had heard worse, she was sure. He had faced down alphas and armies. Her rage was a summer squall against his mountain. "Your choice ended the moment you laid your hands on me," he said, his voice flat and final. "You could have let me die. You didn't. That act of mercy, of instinct, it sealed the bond. The magic does not care what you want, Mayra. It only cares about what is." He started the engine again, the sudden roar shattering the fragile quiet. He pulled back onto the deserted road, heading north into the swallowing darkness. The conversation was over. He had passed his sentence. They drove for hours, in a silence thicker and more suffocating than any that had come before. Mayra stared out the window, watching the endless black pines blur into a solid wall. She felt hollowed out. The girl who repaired watches, the ghost who haunted the city, was well and truly dead. In her place was this trembling, furious creature, branded and claimed by a cursed king. Her wolf, however, was a different story. It was not hollow. It was thrumming with a strange, terrifying energy. The alpha's declaration of mating had sent a shockwave through her primal self. It was a confusing mix of terror and a deep, resonant rightness. The word mate settled in its soul, not as a sentence, but as a homecoming. The instinct was so powerful, so undeniable, that it sickened her. How could she want this? How could any part of her be drawn to this violence, this loss of self? Dawn found them in the foothills of the great northern mountains. The sky bled from black to bruised purple to a pale, watery gray. The air grew colder, cleaner. It smelled of pine and wet stone and the coming snow. This was his land. She could feel it. The very atmosphere acknowledged his presence, bending to his will. Corin finally pulled into a hidden alcove off the main road, concealed by a thick stand of ancient firs. "We rest here," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We'll be at the Citadel by nightfall." The Citadel, the heart of his kingdom, his fortress, her prison. He got out of the truck, moving stiffly. The long drive and the poisoned wound were taking their toll, even on him. He leaned against the vehicle's grill, breathing in the cold mountain air. Mayra stayed inside, watching him. In the gray light of morning, he looked less like a king and more like a soldier after a long, brutal war. The lines on his face were deeper, the scar over his eye a pale, angry mark. Her anger was a shield, but beneath it, a tiny, treacherous seed of something else was taking root. Pity? Empathy? She saw the way his hand went to his bandaged side, the subtle wince he tried to hide. He was not a god. He was flesh and blood. He was wounded, and she was the one who had stitched him back together. The thought was an unwelcome intimacy, a thread that bound them tighter than any magic. He turned, his golden eyes meeting hers through the glass. He gestured for her to get out. Hesitantly, she opened the door and stepped onto the damp earth. The air was so cold it stung her lungs, a shocking contrast to the city's humid smog. The sheer scale of the wilderness was overwhelming. The trees were giants. The mountains were gods on the horizon. It was a world of raw, untamed power, his world. He walked a few paces away, toward a small, gurgling stream that cut through the clearing. He knelt, splashing the icy water onto his face. He looked weary. The iron mask had slipped, just for a moment. A sound, sharp and unnatural, cut through the morning quiet. The snap of a dry twig. Corin froze, his head lifted, his whole body going rigid. He was a predator who had just scented a trap. He turned to her, his eyes blazing with a silent, urgent command. "Get down!" But it was too late. From the trees, they emerged. Not 2 men this time. A dozen. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was not human. Shifters. They were cloaked and hooded, their faces hidden in shadow, but their scent rolled across the clearing in a wave. It was the scent of bloodlust, of pine and cold iron. They were Northlanders, his own people. They formed a semicircle, their positions deliberate, cutting off any escape. These were not hired thugs. These were warriors. Corin rose to his full height, placing himself between Mara and the newcomers. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence was a weapon. The air crackled with his power, his silent, simmering rage. "You dare challenge your king?" Corin's voice was deceptively calm, but it held the deadly promise of a coming storm. One of the figures stepped forward. He was taller than the others, broader. He pushed back his hood, revealing a face crisscrossed with old scars, a beard braided with silver rings, and eyes the color of chips of ice. He was an alpha. Mayra could feel the pressure of his dominance, a pale imitation of Corin's, but formidable nonetheless. "We do not challenge the king," the man said, his voice a gravelly sneer. "We challenge the man who breaks his sacred oath. We saw it in the city. We smelled the abomination you created." His cold eyes flickered past Corin, landing on Mara. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You have taken a mate," the man snarled. "You have broken your promise to the people, to the moon. You have doomed us all with your weakness." Corin's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is not your concern, Fenrir. It is the concern of every pack that swore allegiance to an unmated king." Fenrir roared, his voice echoing through the silent forest. He took a step forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of a large, brutal-looking axe hanging from his belt. "The law is clear. The oath is absolute. An alpha who breaks a blood vow is unfit to rule. He must be cleansed." The other shifters shifted their weight, their hands moving to their own weapons. This wasn't an assassination. It was an execution, a coup. Mara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was her fault. Her existence, her touch, had brought this upon him. Fenrir's rival, the one who had hired the assassins, had clearly sent word to the more fanatical elements of Corin's own kingdom. He was being attacked from without and from within. "You think you can cleanse me?" Corin asked, a low, dangerous laugh rumbling in his chest. It was a terrifying sound. "You, who could not even best my second in a training spar." Fenrir's face contorted with fury. "Your second is not here, and you are wounded, poisoned." He drew his axe, the heavy blade gleaming in the gray light. "And you have a weakness at your back." He lunged, not at Corin, at her. He was impossibly fast, a blur of gray wool and gleaming steel. Mara had no time to scream, no time to run. Her life didn't flash before her eyes. There was only the image of the axe blade swinging toward her head, and a profound, paralyzing certainty of her own death. She would die here, in this cold, strange land, for a king she barely knew. But Corin was faster. He moved like lightning, a blur of black rage. He didn't intercept the axe. He intercepted the man. He met Fenrir's charge with a brutal physical impact that shook the ground. The axe went flying, landing harmlessly in the dirt. Corin's arm snaked around Fenrir's throat, lifting the bigger man clear off his feet. Fenrir choked, his legs kicking uselessly. The other shifters hesitated, stunned by the sheer raw violence of their king. "You!" Corin snarled, his voice a guttural sound that was more wolf than man, his face inches from Fenrir's purpling one. "We'll never touch her." With a final, sickening crunch of bone, He snapped Fenrir's neck. He dropped the body to the ground like a sack of refuse. It landed with a soft final thud. Silence. The forest held its breath. Corin stood over the body of his challenger, his chest heaving, his golden eyes burning with a light that was no longer sane. The taint he had spoken of, the curse in his blood. It was here. It was a living thing, a bonfire of unrestrained fury blazing in his gaze. He looked at the other, shifters, a low, murderous growl ripping from his throat. They looked at their dead leader. They looked at their king, and they saw the monster from their legends. One by one, they backed away. They lowered their weapons. They turned and melted back into the trees, leaving their fallen alpha behind. They were warriors, but they were not suicidal. The clearing was silent again, save for the king's ragged breathing. Maera was frozen, leaning against the truck, her legs too weak to hold her. She had just watched him kill, not like he had in the warehouse, in the swift, efficient dark. She had seen it up close, the rage, the power, the terrifying ease with which he had taken a life to protect hers. He stood there for a long moment, the rage slowly receding, like a tide of blood. The fire in his eyes banked, leaving behind a cold, desolate landscape of ash and regret. He looked broken. He finally turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one of utter self-loathing. He had just proved his challengers right. He had shown them the monster they feared, the monster he had sworn to keep caged. "Now you see," he whispered, his voice a ruin. "Why I swore the oath." He looked at her, the Omega who had somehow become the key to his cage, and his promise. The mark on her hand burned, not with heat, but with a sudden, aching cold. The Alpha's broken promise was not just a political problem. It was a curse made flesh, and he had just fed it blood. The silence that followed the slaughter was a living thing. It was heavier than the corpse lying in the damp leaves. It was colder than the mountain air that scraped Maera's lungs. Corin stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders rising and falling with each ragged breath, a king staring into the abyss he had just created. The rage had passed, leaving a stillness in its wake that was somehow more terrifying. He hadn't looked at her, not since that one, devastating glance filled with self-hatred. It was as if he was afraid of what he might see in her eyes. Fear, revulsion, the very horror he saw in himself. He was right to be afraid. She was terrified. Her heart was a trapped bird, beating its wings raw against the cage of her ribs. She had seen the monster, the untamed, brutal power that flowed in his veins, the curse he called a taint. It was real, and it had killed for her. Her body screamed at her to run. Flee into the woods, disappear, become the ghost again. It was the instinct that had kept her alive for a decade, but her feet were rooted to the spot. Her gaze was fixed on the dark, solitary figure of the king. Running felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of what? Of him? Of this horrifying, unwanted bond? The thought was insane. She owed him nothing. He had destroyed her life, dragged her into his war, and now declared her his mate, a position that would surely get her killed. And yet, he had placed his body between her and that axe. He hadn't hesitated. He had unleashed the very worst part of himself, the beast he kept chained, to save her. He had broken his most sacred vow, not for power, not for lust, but in a moment of pure, protective instinct. He finally moved, his actions slow, deliberate. He knelt beside Fenrir's body. He closed the dead Alpha's, staring ice-blue eyes. It was a gesture of respect, a king's duty to a fallen warrior, even a traitorous one. He showed more grace to his enemy's corpse than he seemed capable of showing himself. "Get in the truck, Maera," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of all emotion. He still didn't look at her. She didn't move. Her voice, when it came, was a trembling whisper. "Are you all right?" A bitter, humorless sound escaped his lips. It wasn't a laugh. It was the sound of something breaking. "I am never all right," he said. He stood, his back still to her, a wall of black wool and rigid muscle. "Go, please." The please was her undoing. The command she could have fought. The plea was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the tormented man beneath the monstrous king. She took a hesitant step toward him, then another. The wet leaves were silent beneath her feet. She stopped just behind him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to smell the faint, lingering scent of his rage, like ozone after a storm. That thing, she began, her voice barely audible. The anger, is that the curse? He went still. For a long moment, he didn't breathe. Then he gave a single sharp nod. It is a fire in the blood, he said, his voice low and strained. A rage that demands an outlet. It grows stronger with each generation of my line. My father, it consumed him. He killed my mother in a fit of it. He didn't even recognize her. The confession fell into the silence. A terrible, heavy stone. Mara's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a political oath. It was a desperate attempt to stop a cycle of inherited madness. He swore me to the oath on her grave, Corin continued, his voice a dead monotone, that I would be the last, that the Valais fire would die with me. An unmated alpha is a contained storm. A mated one. The bond acts as a conduit, a channel. The rage would have a target. It would burn you from the inside out, until there was nothing left. Now she understood, the horror in his eyes when he'd looked at her. It wasn't just because she'd seen him kill. It was because he saw her as the kindling for his own self-destruction. The brand, she whispered, looking at her own hand. The magic. Why would it choose me, if it would destroy me? I don't know, he admitted, and the admission seemed to cost him everything. A king was not supposed to be ignorant. Perhaps the magic is older than the curse. Perhaps it is simply blind. A primal force that seeks only to complete a circuit, no matter the consequence. He finally turned to face her. His golden eyes were bleak, lost worlds of pain. This is why you cannot be my mate. It is why this bond must be fought. I will take you to the Citadel. I will keep you safe, hidden. I will find a way to break this. But I cannot, I will not, be the thing that destroys you. His hands were clenched at his sides, as if fighting the urge to reach for her. The space between them crackled with a tension that was more than just fear or power. It was a deep, aching chasm of impossibility. He was bound to her by a magic he couldn't deny, and sworn to protect her from a curse he couldn't control. And in that moment, watching the raw agony on his face, Mayara Linwen, the girl who had spent her life running, made a choice. She was not a ghost. She was not a victim. She was not a pawn in a game of kings and curses. She was a woman who had been dragged into a storm, yes, but she was still standing. She had survived erasure. She had survived solitude. She would survive this. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but for the first time, it wasn't the only thing she felt. There was a spark, a tiny, defiant ember of something else, anger, determination, and a strange, terrifying thread of connection to him, to this broken, monstrous, honorable king who was trying to save her from himself. She closed the distance between them. He flinched back, taking a half step away, his eyes widening in alarm. Mara, don't. She didn't listen. She reached out her hand, the one with the brand, and gently, deliberately, laid her palm flat against his chest, right over his heart. His breath hitched. His whole body went rigid, as if her touch were a live wire. She could feel the frantic, powerful, hammering of his heart beneath her palm. It was a wild, violent rhythm, a drumbeat of war and torment. Her own wolf, instead of cowering, rose to meet the chaos. A strange calm settled over her, an Omega's instinct to soothe, to quiet the storm. It was a power she had never known she possessed, a part of her she had starved and denied for a decade. You're wrong, she said, her voice quiet but clear, unwavering. The magic isn't blind. He stared down at her, his expression a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. When your blood touched me, she continued, her gaze locked with his, it didn't just wake my wolf. It woke me. I spent my whole life being nothing. Scentless, silent, a ghost. But your blood, it gave me back a name. It reminded me that I exist. His throat worked, but no words came out. He was listening, his entire being focused on her, on the feel of her hand against his chest. Maybe the magic didn't make a mistake, she whispered, her fingers spreading slightly, a gesture of claiming that mirrored the brand on her skin. Maybe it knows something you don't. Maybe a fire like yours doesn't need to be extinguished. Maybe it just needs a safe place to burn. The world seemed to stop. The wind died. The forest held its breath. Corin stared at her, and the bleakness in his eyes was warring with a fragile, burgeoning light. A sliver of hope so terrifying, so dangerous, it was more frightening than the curse itself. He slowly, hesitantly, raised his hand and covered hers, his large, calloused fingers engulfing her own. His touch was warm, possessive, a silent answer. The bond between them flared. It wasn't a violent claiming this time. It was a deep, resonant hum of recognition. Two halves of a fractured whole, finding their shape. His frantic heartbeat began to slow, to gentle, its wild rhythm falling into sync with her own steady pulse. The fire in his blood didn't go out. It quieted, banked, like embers settling in a hearth. For the first time since she'd met him, the air around him felt peaceful. A tear, hot and unexpected, traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or fear. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming relief, of coming home to a place she never knew existed. He saw the tear, and his thumb gently brushed it away, his touch shockingly tender. "Mayra," he breathed, her name a prayer, a question, a surrender. This was not the end of their problems. It was the beginning. A war was coming for him. A coup was brewing. A curse still flowed in his veins. And she was a scentless, packless omega, with a past she refused to speak of, standing in the heart of it all. It was impossible. It was suicide. But as she stood there, in the cold northern wilderness, with a dead man at their feet and a kingdom in turmoil, her hand held over the heart of a cursed king, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was not going to run. She had chosen. The night she was found, the night she was claimed, was over. This was the morning she chose to stay. The snow fell in silence. Each flake was a whispered promise, blanketing the gray stone of the citadel, muffling the world in a soft, white peace. A year since she had stood in the heart of a storm, a ghost claimed by a bleeding king. Now, the storm was over. This was the quiet after, her home. The word still felt new, a fragile, precious thing. Mayra stood on the high stone balcony of the king's tower, her bare feet cold against the frost-kissed granite. She did not feel the chill. A warmth bloomed from her center, a steady, quiet fire that had nothing to do with the roaring hearth inside the chambers behind her. Below, in the courtyard, the pack was stirring. The scents that rose on the crisp morning air were no longer a terrifying cacophony. She could read them now, a language as natural as breathing. The sharp, eager scent of the young hunters preparing for a patrol, the rich, earthy smell of the den mothers, the faint, dry leaf scent of the elders, their wisdom a tangible presence in the air, and her own scent, once a source of terror, now wove through them all, sweetgrass and night-blooming jasmine, a scent of calm, a scent of home, the scent of their Luna. A young wolf, barely more than a pup, saw her and dipped its head in a gesture of clumsy, affectionate respect before chasing after its mother. Mayra smiled, a real smile, one that reached her eyes. She had forgotten how to do that. In the city, she had not forgotten the cost of this peace. The rival Alpha, Fenrir's master, had not given up his claim easily. The winter had been long and bloody, a war fought not just on the borders, but in the hearts of Corin's own people. They had feared his broken oath, feared the curse he carried. They had feared her, but they had feared their king's wrath more, and they had come to see the truth of his bond. She felt him before she heard him. A shift in the air behind her, a deepening of the silence, the scent of pine and winter frost, a scent that was no longer a threat, but the most profound comfort she had ever known. A heavy fur cloak, impossibly warm, was draped over her shoulders. Large, strong hands came to rest on her arms, pulling her, back against a chest as solid as the mountains themselves. Corin. He tucked his head into the crook of her neck, his breath a warm cloud in the cold air. He inhaled deeply, a low, contented rumble vibrating through his chest and into her back. He was scenting her, reaffirming their bond, a morning ritual as sacred as the rising sun. "You'll catch a chill," he murmured, his voice a low, rough velvet against her skin. "The fire keeps me warm," she whispered back, leaning into his strength. He was silent for a moment, his arms tightening around her. A year ago, his touch had been a brand, a claim, a terrifying shock of power. Now, it was her anchor. It was the place the world made sense. "The fire," he repeated, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed to anyone but her. "It is quiet this morning." It was always quiet now. The monstrous, consuming rage, the curse of his line had not reared its head since that day in the forest. It was still there, a great, sleeping beast in the depths of his soul. but it no longer thrashed against its chains. It was at peace. He had feared the bond would be a conduit for his rage, that it would burn her alive. He had been wrong. The bond was not a conduit, it was a hearth, a place for his fire to rest, to warm, to protect. Her calm, the omega nature she had once despised, did not extinguish his flame. It gave it shape, it gave it purpose beyond destruction. "The last of the southern lords bent the knee at dawn," he said, his lips brushing against her temple. "It's over, Mayra. The war is done." She closed her eyes, letting the truth of it settle over her. Over. They had won. They had survived. She turned in his arms to face him. The gray morning light was kind to his harsh features. The scar above his eye was just a part of him now, no longer a mark of violence, but a line in a story she knew by heart. The haunted, self-loathing look that had shadowed his golden eyes was gone. In its place was a fierce, unwavering devotion that still, after all this time, stole her breath. He took her hand, the one that bore his mark. The sigil was a part of her now, a delicate, permanent shadow beneath her skin. He raised it to his lips and pressed a kiss into the center of her palm, right over the brand. "My king," she whispered, the title coming easily to her lips. A faint, rare smile touched his mouth. "My salvation," he corrected, his voice a raw whisper. "You walked into my storm and taught it how to be still." She reached up, her fingers tracing the severe line of his jaw. "You bled on my quiet life and taught it how to live." They stood there as the world awoke, wrapped in his cloak, in his arms. The first rays of the sun crested the snow-covered peaks, casting a wash of pale, silvery light across the valley. A new day, a new era. Their era. The ticking clocks of her old life had measured only borrowed time, a constant countdown to being discovered. Here, with his, heart beating steadily against hers, she finally understood the rhythm of forever. The moon had watched a king bleed and a ghost awaken, but the dawn belonged only to them.